Hello, my name is Christian Buzis, and I will be talking about second species counterpoint, specifically going over example 2.10 in this chapter. Second species counterpoint is different than first species counterpoint, specifically because second species allows for two notes against the one note of the cantus firmus, as we can see shown in measure 2 and then onwards. Whereas in first species counterpoint, you would only be allowed one note against one note from the cantus firmus. Since we're allowed two beats per measure, or two notes against one note of the cantus firmus, we can divide the measure into two essential beats. We have the downbeat, which is the strong beat, and then we have the upbeat, which is the weaker beat. On every strong beat or every downbeat for every measure, we're only allowed to have consonants, but we're allowed to have dissonance in the weak beat, the second beat of each measure. It allows for melodic variation, a little bit more dynamic control. However, there are a couple rules. You essentially want to follow good counterpuntal writing, so avoiding parallel fifths, avoiding dissonance on the downbeats, avoiding large intervals if the intervals are too large. For instance, on measure 2, we see that we have a consonant on the downbeat, and then on the second beat we have a dissonant fourth interval between the C in the alto clef here, and then the F in the treble. We're allowed this passing note because it resolves to a consonant, but it's also simply passing along to a consonant. Then in measure 3, we can see that we are allowed to go consonant into consonant fifth here. If we wanted to go from G to F to get to this E, we would be allowed. But instead, what we would like to do in this situation is add a D against this B to give a little bit more variation in terms of this line. What would have happened is if we would have had this line here, this melodic line would have just been a little bit too simple, and we want that D for a little bit of variety rather than stepwise motion all the time. We do see that we get to this D and then we go up to this E. We do have parallel thirds. We are allowed parallel thirds, just can't have too many of those. The interesting thing is we do see an octave change. So theoretically this is another third, except it's an octave higher than where it was before. And as long as we don't get a fourth third, we should be okay. But essentially what's occurred in this measure here is a register change. So we can assume that this music was written for vocal singers, and a vocal singer with this range would be characterized as an alto singer. Altos typically don't want to sing higher than, I want to say, a B or a C in their register. And so when we see this motion going down to this third, going down and then coming up to this third, we can assume the end of a phrase, and then we can also assume a beginning of the next phrase, essentially having this E present an octave above the previous E assumes that a soprano is now singing and is capable of finishing the rest of this phrase. Although it's not, I guess, jumping out at you and saying, hey, there's an alto and then there's a soprano, it can be assumed just because of the quality and the nature of this melodic phrase. We do see that this 10th comes down to an octave, so we are allowed octaves. We want to avoid too many octaves, but we are clearly allowed the strong consonants on the downbeats, as long as we don't have too many of them, thus making things just a little bit boring. Speaking of consonants and dissonance, if we looked at measure 2 going into measure 3, we saw that the second beat, the weak beat, was a consonant instead of being a diminished or a dissonant rather, a dissonant similar to measure 2 here, having a dissonant passing tone going to this G. We're allowed to have consonant tones as well. So a particular consonant that you might find in contrapuntal writing is 5 to 6, which we have in this measure here, or 6 to 5, which I do not believe we have anywhere here. Lastly, this measure right here, I believe it's measure 7, 6, 7, yes. This measure is needed to be written in this way to avoid the parallel fifths that would have occurred had we had a G. So if you look at the melodic line, you might see that A to G would naturally go to this F, and so that would be good writing, especially since you're moving in the most efficient and clear way to get to this F sharp, so that you can go to this G sharp and then lastly to this A. However, the intervals between this C and this B would have made it so that this would have been a fifth, and then the strong beat on the downbeat of measure, I believe 8 here, yes, would have also been a fifth. Both being perfect fifths, and actually is that not quite. So doesn't look like they're both perfect fifths actually, but because they would both be fifths, you want to avoid that situation. This would be an augmented fifth, so obviously there's something going on between the A and the F sharp, but like I mentioned, avoiding parallel fifths. And then lastly, resolving with a 5 to 6, resolving with contrary motion into this octave A.